Okay, well, order. Secretary of State and CGS, welcome to this, which is the final evidence session in our Future Army 2020 inquiry. And I'd like to begin by asking a question which Secretary of State was asked you, I think, several times yesterday during defence questions, which is, why was the system proposed of a move towards heavier reliance on reserves, why wasn't the drawdown of regulars made contingent on the recruitment of reserves?
Well, first of all, very pleased to be here, and very pleased to see Mr. Gray taking his place on the committee. And very pleased to be accompanied by General Sir Peter Wall, who is also, I'm sure, very happy to be here. On the specific
I'm sorry.
question.
How did that come about?
A bit of demotion.
Minor detail.
Our caption reader has not caught up yet.
Chairman, on the question you asked, which I think, as you say, I was asked yesterday, and I addressed this question in my response yesterday. We have available to us a fixed envelope of resources, and in making a decision to proceed with the drawdown of regular force numbers to the target of around 82,000 and build the reserve over a period of 5 years allows us to invest, to take the dividend from reducing the size of the regular force and invest in the recruitment, training and equipment provision of reserve forces. Now, within the Army's budget, CGS may have something to add to this, but within the Army's budget, it would simply not have been deliverable, it would not have been sustainable to propose retaining a larger regular force and investing in the build-up of reserve forces in the way that we are now doing.
So you are taking the dividend without any certainty that you'll be able to recruit the reserves?
Well, we've been around this ground several times before in various forums. The number of trained reserves that we are targeting is very significantly smaller number than the number that we have traditionally held in this country. 30,000 trained Army reservists by 2018 compares with 72,000 trained Army reservists as recently as 1990. It's a significantly lower proportion of our armed forces than our English-speaking allies typically expect to have hold as reservists in their mix, and we're very confident that we'll be able to deliver this. I'm afraid I recognise the line of questioning, but I'm afraid I just don't see the logic of suggesting that we should hold the regular forces that we have now decided to draw down and restructure, holding them in their old configuration, their old numbers, rather than getting on with the job of reconfiguring them for their future role, a contingent posture post 2014. I'm sure the CGS probably can add more to that.
Well, I remember the genesis of this very clearly. It was a financially driven plan. We had to design a new structure which included the rundown of the 102,000 regular army to 82,000, which is pretty well advanced now, to follow a funded line which was driven by the austerity that everybody's very familiar with, that pervaded, particularly those times, perhaps slightly more than they do now, bearing in mind the economy seems to be picking up. So it triggered the complete redesign of the Army. And I think in this discussion about regulars and reserves, the conversation should include the future reliance on contractors for operations that are in steady state, because that is a very significant part of the equation. And And that is not actually based on conjecture, that's based on proven performance. And you've seen it all yourselves in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And so there are really three legs to the stool. And inevitably, over the period of the rundown of the regular army and before the regrowth or the growth of the reserve from 20,000 to 30,000 and the reconfiguration of the reserve and the integration of the reserve with the regular army and a contractor-based solution, and there's an overlap there. All of that needs to be considered in its entirety. There is a delta where we will have fewer forces in the period 15, 16, 17 than we will from 18 onwards, but that's by design. And it's set against a revised defence planning assumption for what we're going to be doing with our forces, particularly in terms of the potential for enduring operations in the period immediately after we come out of Afghanistan and finish combat operations there at the end of next year. So this is all absolutely in accordance with a strategic design that flows from the national security strategy, and so it's certainly not a surprise to us that we're doing it this way.
Gisela Stewart.
I was quite intrigued because, on the one hand, General Sir Peter Ward confirmed what the Secretary of State at some stage said when the Secretary of State said, the army has now been right-sized in line with budgetary requirements, and you just said we've got a financially driven plan, and there's a logic to a plan. But I'm trying to put an idea to you. If we now have a greater reliance on reservists, there has to be an interest within the existing army structure to make that plan work. And in the nature of human nature, why should the established army have an interest in making a plan to make reservists even more important work? It is not in their own institutional interest. And to make that very specific, if you look at the organizations which used to do the recruiting when they did a good job, to the current structure, which doesn't seem to be doing quite such a good job, aren't you facing a bit of an institutional flaw in your argument?
I don't think so. I mean, first of all, whilst there may well be some individuals who harbour the sentiment that you're describing, that's not how the army works. We don't have 82,000 people who just get up every day and decide what to do based on their own personal sentiment. That's really the reason why we have an army with an ethos that's perhaps slightly different from other parts of society. And there is a leadership challenge, but the fact that these two things are distinctly different in time has made it very clear to the units that will exist in the adaptable force in the future construct, many of which are moving to that posture as we speak, have established their partnership with their reservist counterparts in the adaptable force and are getting on with it, which is what people do when they're given a clear-cut plan and the right sort of leadership and motivation. That anybody who is malingering out of resentment will be rooted out as you would expect.
I think, if I may say, it's also quite important that this isn't business as usual for the regular army, and we're doing something different with the reserves. There's change going on throughout the army, the move to an integrated army, restructuring of the regular army as well as reserves. So there is a lot of change going on, and the message is that this is, in future, a single integrated army. Now, as the CGS has said, is that a challenge to get that message across and to get people thinking like that? Of course it is, but it's a challenge the army are delivering on.
I think we should also be very open that when we were told that this will be the size of the future regular army and this will be the size of the reserve, the Horton Commission's recommendations having been taken account of, it was we, the army, who decided to integrate this thing the way we have. That was a conscious internal strategy, because it's the only way we will get the competence at a collective level from the future reserve that we need in order to deliver the overall capacities and capabilities that we will require in the future. So it's a starkly different model from anything we've done in recent history.
what I'm trying to suggest to you, and some of my colleagues may want to test this a little bit more in detail, but just structurally, the existing army has every interest in not making the reservist model work because it is in their own institution. And there may be kind of, okay, let me do a very...
Can I just disagree with that entirely and explain why?
Let me give you a very practical question. What proportion of initial applicants have completed phase 2 training over the last year?
What proportion of?
What proportion of initial applicants completed phase 2 training over the last year?
There will, by the end of this calendar year, be up to 1,000, it might be just short, depending on failure rates over the next 2 or 3 months, people who will have completed phase 2 training in this calendar year.
But there won't have been applicants within the calendar.
No, I mean,
it takes much longer to get
means
through the
nothing. If it's
pipeline.
1,000 out of 100,000, that's minimal. If it's 1,000 out of 2,000,
But there will be very few people who will, in the same year that they applied, complete phase 2 training. There will be some, but for the majority, it's a 2-year journey because of the way our training model is structured for the reserve.
Would you like to go back and probably write to me in more detail?
I think you're asking a different question. You're asking a question about conversion rates from initial application to the completion of phase 2 training.
What I'm trying to get to, and again I say some of my colleagues may want to come back on that, you've got an enormously ambitious program, which means you've got an army which can no longer function unless it actually has got the reserve forces as a component.
No, I reject that. We've got a situation, as I understand it, CGS can add to this, is that in order to support an enduring operation in future, we will be more dependent on reserves than we have been in the past. But if you ask me, this debate has been conducted in terms of the austerity agenda and the need for fiscal discipline. But for a country which expects to be at peace, it makes sense to me to hold capabilities that you will only need in an extended, enduring operation in a reserve force. It does not make sense, fiscally or militarily, to hold those capabilities in a regular force when you do not expect to need to use them on a regular basis. That's
I'm not
simple
challenging
discipline.
that at the moment. I'm challenging whether the structure you've put in place will actually make it practically capable. Some of my colleagues may want to have more detailed questions.
I'd like to bring in Sir Bob Russell briefly here and then move on to Julian Brazier.
Secretary of State, General Sir Peter Wall could not have been more clear. This is a financially driven plan, and then the military then have to work out a military answer to a financially driven agenda. And we're here as a three-legged stool: regulars, reservists and contractors. If it is correct that the recruitment of reservists is a very ambitious target, is not going according to that plan, would it not be in the national defence interest to be prudent and to retain at least some of the battalions which you wish to dispense with? Wouldn't it be prudent just to hold those numbers in real reserve?
No, I don't think so. I don't think it would ever be prudent to proceed on an unsustainable budgetary basis. What you would be suggesting is proceeding with a model that could not be financed, and I don't think that would be sensible. I think it's also critical to understanding this argument that we are not simply replacing regulars with reservists. It isn't about getting rid of regular infantrymen and replacing them with reserve infantrymen. It's about changing the shape of the force so that more of the supporting capabilities are held in the reserves. And because of the nature of the structure of the army in the future, we will have different types of capability in the reserve and in the regular. So I don't think it's as simple as you're suggesting.
It may be then the Prime Minister is not on the same wavelength with you, because you checked with Hansard when I put a question to him. He explained that by reducing the number of regulars, and replacing a reservist, the army would be basically the same size it is now. So I think perhaps around the cabinet table, the Prime Minister needs to be briefed on exactly what the...
There's a difference between saying the army will be the same size and saying it will be the same structure. The capabilities held in the reserves will change as a result. CGS.
Well, I come back to my point about the balancing piece being how we will use contractors for logistic support in an enduring context, which is a proven concept and one where we are probably behind other armies around the expeditionary sort of in an expeditionary context, particularly the Americans. So frankly, I would rather we continued with our plan, where, as the Secretary of State says, we have a balance between what we spend on manpower, an improving equipment position, the amount we can train, the force of the size it's designed to be, and then all of the sustainability that's vital to making this instrument useful, whether in a short-term intervention context or an enduring operation, no matter how unlikely that might be in the future. So just to hang on to more manpower when you haven't got the balance across the rest of the equation doesn't actually help us.
So is there a contingency plan that should the recruitment reservists not meet the target, is there a point when you'll need to review your strategy?
Well, we will, whatever we do in the future, we will have to operate within the budgetary constraints that we face. We're confident that we're going to be able to meet the reserve recruiting targets, but if we found that we were not building the reserve force at the rate or the speed that was required, the Army would clearly have to review how it utilised the components of force that it had available in a way that delivered the military effect we require.
Thank you.
That's an interesting answer. So,
Well, self-evidently true, isn't it?
So the army would not set out to take steps to rebuild the regulars if the reserves.
Chairman, I don't understand what is so challenging about the proposition that there is a finite budget. I mean, it's not about setting out to take steps to employ more people, buy more stuff. We have a limited budget and we have to work within it. We do not have an option of going back to a construct that we've moved away from in order to build a sustainable force for the future within the budget envelope that we've got.
Okay. CGS, you gave one answer just now, which was when we were told that this will be the size of the regular army and that this will be the size of the reserves, who told you what the size of the regular army would be and who told you what the size of the reserves would be?
The size of the regular army I was told by the Permanent Secretary, and the size of the reserve came out of the findings of the Wharton Commission.
Thank you. Julian Brazier.
Yes. CGS, nobody could possibly doubt the extent to which you're personally committed to making this work, and the fact that you, within a week or two of embracing it, had both appointed a 2-star to make sure that the reserves had their own voice in the process and had got the FT moving on the employer front is just a very small part of the evidence. I'd like to ask you, though, talking to people across a range of units, one hears a lot about other bits of the process that are going well, but the feedback on the recruiting is all negative, not for reasons that have anything to do with application numbers. Can I just bounce a few specifics off you? Why is it that recruiting offices, which are not just places for footfall, but also have some of the key portals to access the system, are open 9 to 5 Monday to Friday, rather than, say, doing 3 days from 9 till 9, so people with civilian jobs can come in? I mean, that's one example. Let me give you 3 of them. A second one is security checks. If you say to a guy, well, we've got you all excited, we've done the initial aptitude weekend, here you are with a bunch of mates, but it's going to take 6, maybe 8 weeks to do a security check on you, come back. Doesn't that break it up? But I mean, the wider question is, the RFCAs ran this process very well until 7 years ago. is Recruiting Group really the right body to do this? Because nobody I speak to thinks they really get the reserve bid.
I'm not sure how up to date you are with the new system and whether you've had a chance to visit the apparatus that's now set up.
Well, I'd love to do so, but
Because I think you'll find that trying to hark back to a bygone era is not the way to go forward in this regard. I mean, the people who we want to encourage to join the reserve are not people who are going to learn about it by walking down the high street and walking into a shop, whether it's open at, during working hours or after working hours. They're going to do it all, they're going to do all of it on digital media. That's why we have embraced a partnership with Capita, and that's why we're going forward down that track for recruiting both regulars and reserves. In so doing, we've been able to reduce the number of soldiers doing back office functions. Soldiers are still doing front office functions in terms of contact with these people, which is of course very, very important to develop their enthusiasm once they've made initial contact. And I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that our sort of attract and sort of enlist and feed into initial training pipeline is working nearly as smoothly as I would like. But I think if you were to come down, and maybe the committee would like to visit, you'd get a sense of just how much momentum there is behind this and how determined people are in concert with our commercial partners to make it work, and I'm confident it will.
But the comment that constantly comes back, I mean, just on the online bit, is that whenever people, you have a batch of recruits who you like to start training together, because then you get all the ties that come and encourage to follow through the weekend process and so on. And you find one guy's system's been lost because he didn't fill in one of the 50 fields correctly and the machine didn't tell him. And the next guy's got stuck on a security check, and somebody else has had a problem on a medical. Not that he's failed the medical, but just something's gone wrong with the paperwork. And so it goes on.
All
and
these,
on.
that you will no doubt have lots of stories of that ilk, which sort of in a sense are in stark contrast to the experience the majority are having. I don't believe we'd have a hope of getting to the numbers that we need in the fullness of time if we were to go back to the retrograde systems that we had hitherto. They just required far too much time and effort with people who actually we need to be involved in more productive outcomes. This is a business of raw numbers in one sense, but it's also about producing collective capability. And that is the really significant delta between the past and the future. And we've got to make sure we don't devote nearly all of our effort to existing by having a cumbersome recruiting system, and that we actually streamline that so that the military talent can be used to enhance its capability. And that's we're in the foothills of that plan.
Well, can I just add to that? I acknowledged yesterday in defence questions that there are some IT teething troubles at the start of this programme, and there's a lot of attention going into this, and where there are things that we can do that will ameliorate problems that are being created by the IT startup problems, we will do that. And I went down to the Army Recruiting Centre last Wednesday, was it, and heard of a range of initiatives and pilots that are being tried out right now to overcome some of the specific problems that you've mentioned and that other people have mentioned to me over the last few weeks.
Last point. I mean, if there's still one organisation left, admittedly they have huge advantages, who do a one-stop weekend, do it all over a weekend, and that's the OTCs, and it works brilliantly there. If we could get back to a one-stop shop with the other things being picked up in slow time, whether it's security checks.
We've got a plan to import some of that experience with a sort of modified initial sort of joining standard such that we're not putting people at risk.
Good.
So that idea is a good one, and it's being embraced. Thank you.
Thank you.
Adam Holloway.
John, I won't bore you with anecdotes, but there really does seem to have been, certainly hitherto, a problem. I mean, a godchild of mine was delayed by 6 weeks, I think, because she couldn't take some attested papers to a recruiting office on a Saturday, or had a captain who's being made redundant from the army as we speak, in my office yesterday. He said he and his mates who were leaving actually weren't going to bother going to the TA because it was being made so difficult for them. I don't know what was behind his comment, but I think there is a problem.
We're actually we're exceeding by some margin our initial expectation of conversions from the regular army into the reserve, which is an important part of delivering this uplift in competence in the short term.
I'm not criticising, I'm just saying that
yeah.
anecdotes, there are plenty of anecdotes out there and they seem to be believable.
Keys for Stuart.
In a previous evidence session, Secretary of State asked you a question to complete a sentence, and having listened to the evidence about right-sizing budget, who told you, I said to you, what do you think the army is for? Now, I thought the army was primarily for defence of the realm. At what stage would the needs of defence of the realm make you think you ought to look at the budgetary requirement again?
Well, if your question is in what circumstances would I be arguing for an increase in the defence budget, that's really a question for strategic defence and security review, of which there will be one in 2015, looking at the overall picture of what it is we require our armed forces to do and what resource envelope the taxpayer is prepared to commit to doing that. For the time being, based on the 2010 SDSR, we have a very clear remit. We know what the role and the requirement is. We know what the capabilities that we have to deliver are in Future Force 2020, and what the CGS and the other service chiefs are doing is constructing a force structure that will allow them to deliver that capability on a sustainable basis within the budget envelopes that they've been given. And I think that's absolutely the right way to go about it. If I may say so, I think the experience of the recent past is that there is no mileage in dreaming of a force structure that cannot be properly supported by the available budgets. That has created only chaos and dislocation. We have to operate on a sustainable basis so that people have confidence about the future, and they have confidence that they will be properly equipped, properly trained to carry out the task that they're being asked to do.
I won't push this, but I would just like to leave you with one thought. I don't dream of anything, but I occasionally fear that the enemy of the realm may not be working to the same timetable as you do. And let's hope that I'm wrong and you're right.
Derek Twig.
CGS, when I think you said the permanent secretary told you what the size of the army would be, how did you feel?
Well, I've moved on from there now.
Well, that's not the question. I asked you a specific question. How did you feel?
I thought it was going to be a bit of a challenge to galvanise the army into getting on with the job of shrinking and rebuilding. But so I wasn't thrilled to bits to start with. But we set up a design team basically. We got approval from the permanent secretary to bow out of the detail of the programming round because we didn't know what structure we were trying to sort of do our financial calculus
Sorry,
against.
just repeat that, sorry, I didn't quite understand that.
We bowed out of the programming round in the ensuing year in detail because we were essentially engaged in a design to cost exercise.
So you lost a year?
No, we didn't lose a year. We didn't do the unnecessary work of trying to program in financial detail a structure that we hadn't yet designed. So we were allowed to take a reasonably long-term systematic view of how to interpret the national security strategy and pull together the two components, the regular reserve, into what we decided should be an integrated structure, and to do that in the context of the three distinct roles for the army that came out of the national security strategy, that of a contingent capability to deliver conventional deterrence and defence first, second, the defence engagement proposition with upstream capacity building and building bilateral relationships with regional partners, and thirdly, UK resilience operations in the homeland. And so we were what I'm really saying is that after a bit of a shock, we were afforded the time to do a really thorough and systematic job taking account of a lot of campaign lessons from Afghanistan, taking account of some experimentation and modelling, taking account of some DSTL support to make sure that what we were doing was actually consistent with defence planning assumptions and so on and so forth. And what we then put to the Secretary of State the following June for announcement in July was the product of a year's work. It wasn't, as had tended to be the case in the previous couple of years, a series of sort of 3 or 4 month exercises conducted in haste.
After being told by the Permanent Secretary, did you make any representations to the Secretary of State asking to review that decision?
No, I was very keen to make sure that what I was going to be telling the Army would be the implications of these big sort of bits of news was consistent with what the Secretary of State and the Prime Minister thought would be the news to the country, i.e. a single version of the actuality. And in terms of how many regular units and cap badges might be affected, the extent to which we could or could not, subject to further work, offset some of the implications of reducing the regular structure with more sort of tutored use of a competent reserve, all that sort of stuff.
Well, that's not the question. Ask the question whether you made any representations to the Secretary of State, in other words, in opposition to what you'd been told by the Permanent Secretary. And given you said you were in shock, are you saying you made no representation to the Secretary of State?
You're looking at me, just to be clear, of course, I wasn't Secretary of State.
No, but you are Secretary of State.
This wasn't.
I won't blame you for the things that you're responsible for. Go on, sorry.
This wasn't an utter surprise. The proposition had been floating around.
You were in shock, General. Just said you were in shock.
Well, the proposition had been. How do you want to do this?
Well, I'd like you to answer the question.
Okay. What, starting now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
So
try again, I think.
Sorry?
Try again, yes, that would be good.
All right, okay. So can we just go through the question again?
You want me to do the question again? Yeah. What representation did you make to the then Secretary of State after you got over the shock about the cuts that had been made to the Army?
I didn't make a representation.
You made no representation whatsoever?
No.
Not a single word?
No.
Okay. Can I come to you, Secretary of State?
And what's the point of the question?
I'm asking the questions, General.
Oh.
Just hang on, sorry. The Secretary of State, could you tell me, please, in terms of the comments you made about living in the financial envelope, the representations that were made to you, that must have been made to you by the senior officers about what they required, as opposed to what you then gave them, can you tell us what the gap was?
Sorry, when you say...
Well, they must have put to you what they required as part of the discussions in terms of the need for the future defence of this country. You gave them an envelope to work within.
I think the
what was
situation that I inherited was that the 82,000 army had already been agreed, and the army was in the process of putting together a restructuring plan to deliver within that 82,000. So the 82,000 was already a planning given, a planning assumption within the department and within the army by the time I arrived.
Well, we just heard from CGS that it was a shock to him when he was told the size of the army by the Permanent Secretary. So the army must have made some representations to you or your predecessor about what they would like in terms of resources.
I can't comment on what representations may have been made to my predecessor.
The idea of an army that was going to be reduced to 82,000 regulars had been floating around in the department all the way through the defence review process. And we thought we had marshalled sufficiently strong arguments to explain why, as an extrapolation of the way we were doing business then, this was not something we thought was going to be very easy to cope with at all. And the shock was that those arguments had not carried. We have, of course, been through all of this in my previous evidence, where I sat here for 2 hours going through these points, which no doubt you could refer to.
Can I make another point, Chairman? I'm not trying to change the subject, but I think this is important context. And I've said it a couple of times recently in speeches. The number of people in the Army is essentially an input measure. And what we really need to focus on is delivering the military effect that is required. Wages in any normal functioning economy, rise faster than the GDP deflator at which we can expect our budget to increase. 30% of our budget goes, roughly 30% of our budget goes on military wages. We have to improve our productivity. In other words, we have to improve the amount of military capability we can deliver with a given set of inputs. And one of the things that's being done here in restructuring the army is looking at using contractors, using reservists where they can be used to support enduring operations where we don't need to have the standing capability in the regular army, using civilians where they can do jobs that have hitherto been done by military personnel, because civilians and contractors and reservists are all cheaper than regular army personnel. And if we are going to deliver military effect within a constrained budget, it is absolutely incumbent upon us, all of us, to do it in the most productive way possible to get the maximum military effect out of the budgets that are available to us. So I think the challenge is not does the regular army have to reduce in size in response to the fiscal circumstances, but how can we then intelligently restructure the army in a way that allows us to deliver a smaller cut in military output than the cut we have seen in resource inputs. And I think with credit to the army, that is exactly what they've done.
That is a point well made. But one of the concerns that has been expressed to us on the Army Rumour Service website is that 82,000 is not the end of it, that it could go to 60,000. Now, if the Permanent Secretary, CGS, had come to you and said, it's not going to be 80,000, 82,000, it's going to be 60,000, would you have reacted in exactly the same way? Would you have said...
that would not have been a feasible way of achieving the defence planning assumptions that that underpin the work we had done.
Whereas you thought that 82,000 was?
I thought that I wasn't happy with it, but actually going back to the Secretary of State's point, and I wouldn't want you to take too much long-term comfort from this, but in the situation we've been in the last 2 or 3 years, necessity has been the mother of invention, and we've come up with a way of integrating this force, regular reserve contractors and civil servants and so on, in a way that I think is going to give us a way of minimising the delta in capability terms, probably 10% rather than the 20% that's implied in the manpower reduction from 100,000 to 80,000. And there are some places where, of course, we would like a little bit more resilience, but everybody would say that, no matter what their force structure is.
Adam Holloway.
I mean, to take the Secretary of State's point further, would it be fair to say that the generals realised that these astronomical levels of debt, you actually have to cut your cloth to go with them? And we're already doubling the national debt in this Parliament.
Well, I think two things. First of all the senior military officers I have dealt with since I've been in this job, however much they may wish to discuss or protest even a specific issue, do get the context in which we're having to deal with this, and they absolutely understand it. But they also have a very specific focus on this. They have seen the consequence of defence living in a budgetary hiatus where nothing had any meaning anymore because the numbers didn't add up. Nobody had any expectation that the budgets or the programmes would be delivered. And I think we can all see, and have seen over the last couple of years, that by operating in an environment where budgets mean something, they are adhered to, programmes by and large are delivered as they're meant to be delivered, is actually a much more sensible planning environment and allows you to get much more out for the resource that goes in. An awful lot of waste was generated by the uncertainty and the inefficiency in the old system of over-programming and under-budgeting.
Madeleine Moon.
Secretary of State, I wonder if I can take you back to the issue of national security, which is what drives all of our questions, and the fact that perhaps we don't have your confidence that national security will be protected why these changes are being implemented. Can I just go back to you, in terms of, you said what wouldn't be happening would be one infantryman out and one reservist in. That wasn't what you were looking for, but you were looking for support capability that would be held in reserve, and that this would be often specialists. Have the recruiting agencies looking for the reservists been given specific targets, perhaps for medical staff, for your cyber warriors, I think you called them? Have they been told what specialist capability to look for, or are they looking for general overall infantry? What are we actually looking to recruit?
I'm going to ask the CGS to answer the detailed question. You mentioned two areas, medical and cyber. In medical, of course, we already have an excellent relationship with the NHS, and our medical reservists play a hugely important role in our deployable capability. I can also tell the committee that the response to the call for cyber reservists has been very substantial. We've had, I think, over 800 applications to join the cyber reserve in the couple of weeks since that call was made. But in terms of trade specialisms, the Army, of course, expects to provide training. It's not necessarily looking for recruits who have these skills already available to them. It too is a big trainer of trade skills. In fact, I think the Army is the largest provider of apprenticeships in the country. But if I could ask the CGS to answer the specific questions around specialisms and trade skills.
We're absolutely trying to recruit to a force structure that covers the range of disciplines that the reserve force as a whole is required to produce. Those are, of course, done in geographically around the country, in reserve regiments and battalions that may have 2 or 3 outposts, company level drill halls, those sorts of things. And so the real trick here is to match the trades with the reservists who are interested in joining in proximity to the unit in the area where they're living. Now, some of the organisations, and particularly the things like cyber and some of the communications capabilities and perhaps the intelligence capability, is organised on a national basis. But most of these regiments in the reserve, the 70 plus regiments in the reserve, have a geographical locus, and the particular trade skills that go with that cap badge or function are the people they're trying to recruit. And within each of those there'll be a miscellany of trades, whether it's driving or sappering or being an IED expert or a communicator, in the case of the Royal Engineers, or if you're in the Royal Artillery, another range of skills associated with those with that pastime. And so we actually do have a bit of a mosaic to populate here, but people are absolutely going out to do it in a specific way rather than saying, well, let's get 30,000 people and then work out what we're going to do with them. And I know you're not suggesting that, but that's the sort of the other extreme. I think that when you look at this in the abstract at the national level, it can, feel a bit complicated and daunting, but of course when it's delegated down to them and enacted at the local level, and after all, the territorial army is a localised phenomenon, and the reserve is an extrapolation of that, then you will be down in a particular district of the country. They will know what the employer base is. They will know which units they have to populate. They will be paired with a regular unit with the same professional functions and trades in a reasonably localised context, not quite as close as we might like geographically, but as best as we can make it. And then it starts to become a much more personalised, localised and specific proposition to link the individual reservist with the unit and the employer. And I recognise that a lot of people join the reserve to do something different from the skill they use in their workplace. But of course, in some of the areas where the reserve has the most to contribute, we will be very interested in getting people who sustain their proficiency in their day job and can extrapolate that into the reserve space. And that then, of course, adds to the sort of feedback benefit when you start applying those skills in a military context where there might be a bit of pressure on or the conditions are adverse, in terms of the experience that individual then takes back into his or her company. And that's where the benefit starts to accrue for the employer. Added to which, as these people move through the ranks, they'll get command and leadership training, which must also be of general benefit, A to an employer, B across society.
Thank you.
Chairman, can I just correct the record? I said that I thought there had been 800 applications to Surrey Reserve in the first month. Actually, 800 expressions of interest in the first month.
Thank you.
So we still need potentially another 29,000 reservists. Can I just, Secretary of State, have from you an assurance that you will be constantly reviewing the impact on the defence of the realm? Not waiting for the next SDSR, but constantly reviewing the impact on the defence of the realm of our drawdown, our reduction in the standing capability, while we are still not recruiting their replacement as reservists. That won't be something that you'll put off until the next review. It will be something that you are looking at constantly.
Yeah, it will be looked at constantly, and it will take this form. We have a number of tasks and capabilities which the military is required to deliver. And if at any point any of the service commanders was in a position where they felt they couldn't deliver those outputs, they would flag that to the Defence Board through the Armed Forces Committee. So we have a mechanism for doing that.
And you're confident that people would feel capable of doing so, that they wouldn't be in so much shock that they wouldn't actually come forward?
Well, perhaps you should ask the CGS just to speak on behalf of the military commanders. How would they react to such a situation?
We have a set menu of potential tasks at a projected scale, which of course aren't just about numbers of people. It's about capability, the ability to train for it effectively, and to have the right sort of logistic support structures and so on, including where we need it, the ability to draw contractors into the plan. And we report quarterly through to the Defence Board on our ability to meet those tasks. So it's in continual review.
James Gray.
Linked to that, yesterday, Secretary of State, in defence questions, you indicated that you'd be issuing a series of targets for recruitment of the Royal Reserves. Can you tell us when those targets will be produced and what they'll roughly be like?
I said in the autumn originally. I said today that I hoped it would be very soon. I don't want to preempt what the numbers will be, but they will be accompanied by a narrative explaining why they are set in the way they are.
So will be set numbers by February 2014. We will have aimed to have recruited X number. Is that
we're going to look at recruiting as well as numbers in the trained reserve, because of course the two are not the same, but one is a leading indicator for the other. So I think both numbers will be of interest to the House.
And achievement or non-achievement of those targets is scrutinised by the House or by an independent organisation or by whom?
Well, they'll be published quarterly by DASA, by the Defence Statistics Agency. So this is a new data series that we haven't previously published, recruiting data. It will be published on November the 14th for the first 3 quarters of 2013, and thereafter it will be published quarterly. So it will be available for scrutiny by the House and external commentators.
Differs from the figure in the targets, what happens then?
If there is a significant discrepancy, a persistent and significant discrepancy, clearly the plan will have to be revised. The plan will not be delivering. But I wouldn't like the committee to get the impression that there is, a single set of possibilities for delivering this target output. There are many strands to the recruiting programme. And CGS and I have discussed, and we've discussed with many other people, things that we might introduce if we find that elements of the current plan are not delivering what we expect them to deliver. There will be pilots of different approaches to see what works and what doesn't work. One of the things that the introduction of Capita as our recruiting partner will do is deliver us a far more analysis of the process. Because of the commercial environment in which they operate, they are used to analysing the results that are delivered by different types of approach. We do not have in the department at the moment what I would call proper data showing what the response to different types of marketing approach, different types of pitch to potential recruits are. So we don't know what we're good at doing and what we're not good at doing.
Can I ask one last question there, which is this. Leaving aside the management complexity that kindly described, which could be used, of course, to disguise the reality, quite possible to say, here's a... will you undertake the committee to be absolutely straightforward if you're not achieving the targets that you set out? Will you be undertaken to be absolutely straightforward about that and to lay out what the change in plan would be as a result? Because the risk would be that you'll come back in February, March next year, or next autumn, whatever it might be, and you'll say, well, if you look at it this way, we can possibly argue and spin it, we can fiddle around with it, we can produce a management speak answer that seems to demonstrate that actually it's all okay. Will you undertake, if it's not okay, if you aren't achieving the targets of recruitment or reserves, will you undertake to be absolutely straightforward about that?
Well, I don't see how I can be more straightforward than committing to publish the raw data on recruitment numbers on a quarterly basis, something that's never been done before. But I can assure you that from Secretary of State, Ministers, Chief of the General Staff, Chief of the Defence Staff, all the way down, there is a huge amount of focus on this issue. We will be publishing quarterly data, but I can assure you we are scrutinising weekly reports of recruiting numbers.
And when you say you'd have to revise the plan if it weren't achieving the recruiting that you need, that would include, might it, a change to the incentives for reservists and or employers?
It could certainly do that. Do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're 3 months into a 5-year campaign. So the sort of pessimism that pervades this line of questioning is a little bit difficult to kind of relate to. We're taking a campaign approach to this for reasons that we could go into in detail. We're aware that we haven't got off to the best start in terms of our IT solution, and this is very much a digitally based approach. That's being remedied as fast as we can sort it out. And there are plenty of levers, which are sort of hardish financial levers, and on the other hand, engagement type levers with the community and with employers, that we are working our way through. We don't have the bandwidth, and I don't think any organisation would, to be honest, to do all this in one go, start everything on day naught. We are essentially rolling out a succession of ideas. Having got the big idea out there, we're now actually looking at a number of niche approaches where we think we can enhance our prospects of growing this fairly rapidly, and that's what we're doing.
CGS, when you talk about the pessimism that pervades these questions, it is based on the experience to date. I think you will accept that. It is based on the fact that we are doing something that this country has never done before. I think you'll accept that. And it is based on reducing the regular army to a size that it hasn't been since probably Cromwellian times, and I think you'll accept that. So it is, I think, the role of this committee to ask, what does happen if these rather extraordinary things go wrong? Is it not?
Yeah, I understand that, but we've had as the Secretary of State pointed out earlier, in recent memory, we've had a much more significant reserve force than we are aspiring to grow in this period. Now, I accept that there are some other differences. Levels of competence expected on an individual and collective basis for discretionary operations, which is a rather different phenomenon from a war of national survival like the Cold War.
Yes.
So the risk equation is slightly different. I'm not suggesting it's like for like.
And it's
in terms of the sheer size of it, we've been there before for most of the lives of the people in this room.
Yes, and it's also very reassuring to hear the Secretary of State say that we are a country that expects to be at peace. Expectations can sometimes be dashed. Bob Stewart.
Secretary of State and CGS, we visited Afghanistan last week, and I have to say, the soldiers I spoke to had high morale all round. I think everyone would agree with that, and even in my old regiment, when they saw me. However, the Army Rumour Service says there is low morale in various pockets of the Army. Principally, I suspect, those people are not in combat, because combat actually raises morale automatically. May I ask both of you how you assess the state of morale at the moment in the Army, perhaps in various patches of it? We know the answer in Afghanistan, it's high. But for the rest of the people contemplating the future, how do you assess morale at the moment, which is, of course, we all know is crucial?
I think that's a great question for me. That's my job is to...
I didn't mean I was doing
yes,
it.
I agree. Yes, it is. Well, I think there are some people who are fearful of uncertainty, who have seen, if they haven't left the army, they might have seen some of their close pals doing so, either voluntarily or through enforced redundancy, who are seeing changes to their regimental structure, and that sort of generates more uncertainty, and who have had their pay and allowances marking time, if not, in real terms, diminishing. And, all organisations find uncertainty coupled with sort of complex change a bit of a challenge. But I don't think if you look at morale through the lens not of are people happy, but are they committed to carrying on serving, then our outflow rate suggests that the situation is about normal. And if you then judge morale in operational terms by the extent to which people are prepared to turn to and do what's asked of them in a crisis, I can guarantee you that we have absolutely no problem whatsoever, and what you saw in Afghanistan would be a clear and present manifestation of that. But I do think that the gradual progression of the announcing of our Army 2020 plan and the underpinning detail that goes with it is allowing that uncertainty to progressively be shaded out, and for people to understand more clearly what the nature of future service in the Army 2020 structure, primarily back here in UK, of course, by 2018, 2019, is going to entail. There are a number of aspects of that which are enhancing to morale, the certainty about where people are going to be based, given they know what regiment they're serving in, and therefore the implications for their families of where they might want to live, send their children to school, and so on and so forth. So I think that, against the uncertainty we've got, and the morale impact of that, we've got clarity rolling out slowly, which gives me confidence that we're going to end up in a good place. There are inevitably some people who would rather the change happen faster. We need to take particular care of the diminishing rump of forces left in Germany, who have intended to be very well provided for in the past, to make sure that we sustain that quality of life for them until such time as their units move back in the 2017-2018 timeframe. And the things that will have a big impact there are obviously the extent to which the soldiers are able to engage in challenging and meaningful and relevant training that points to the future use of the army, but actually as important things like the healthcare and education system, which obviously we've got to sustain right up to the last person.
Yes. Some people would say that the model that you've now established is not unfamiliar to the British Army. Depends where you start from when you want to have a look. Particularly the question about the involvement of contractors. But can I ask you two sets of questions, really? One is about scrutiny, both independent scrutiny and general scrutiny of what is going to go on over time. Because this is a plan to 2020 that will cross parliaments, it'll cross SDSR reviews and so on. And can I also, sort of, in doing that, test this whole idea about integration, which is a central feature of the success of the structural changes that you're making. So we seem to have the structures, we've got numbers, we've got assumptions and tasks that those will have to carry out, so the numbers can get bigger, smaller, flexibility, change, all against budgets. But can I ask you how all of this is being tested and what independent challenge and scrutiny there is? You talked, General Peter, about some modelling and evidential stuff that was at the very start of creating the structure, and that's one thing. But these other questions now are how the structure is going to be populated and what its utility is. What is going to happen in terms of independent scrutiny and independent challenge to those things?
I don't know. I don't know that there's a model that can test the readiness of the military. We exercise, obviously, but only when you deploy at scale to deliver the output that you are mandated to deliver, do you demonstrate that capability in total. But I think I should just say something about the point that you've made about the Future Force 2020 being a cross-parliament target. That is right, of course. But the SDSR 2015 will certainly want to look at the Future Force 2020 construct and decide whether it needs to evolve further to 2025 in response to a changing environment. We don't expect this to be a static position, and I'm afraid anybody who hankers for a world in which we once reset the structure and then freeze it forever is going to be disappointed. The likely future is one of scanning the horizon, monitoring changing threats, changing technologies, changing resource envelopes, and constantly evolving how we respond to those challenges. So I don't know what the outcome of SDSR 2015 will be, but it's perfectly possible that it will set a new set of parameters for Future Force 2025, which develop the force from what we've set out for Future Force 2020.
Well, that's the very reason I asked the question, because it'll be about pacing and phasing and all of that and flexibility. So how are you going to understand and let other people contribute to an understanding of what is the best thing to do at any given time?
In the SDSR?
Well, in both that and the ongoing implementation of both Army 2020 and in another report we'll do on Force 2020.
I mean, on the SDSR, as I think I said when we talked about SDSR the last time I was before the committee, it is our clear intention that Parliament, this committee, and indeed external commentators should have an opportunity to participate in shaping the debate in the run-up to SDSR 2015, and the Prime Minister will announce in due course how we intend to do that.
I think that, there's no design manual for how to produce an army. There are quite a lot of subjective judgments here, which are a mixture of art and science. And we sought, when we were doing the work I was describing, when we essentially took this year to engage in what's primarily a blank sheet of paper exercise to start with, to work out the extent to which we could use consultation within the Army and focus groups within the Army, particularly in the more junior ranks, those who've been involved, the warrior generation, as I call them, the ones you've met in Afghanistan, but who've done multiple tours in there in Iraq, to get their sense of the way we should go, to make sure we drew in the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan in the round, of which there's a raft of them which are going on a rapid sort of cycle to shape the next deployment. But there's also some stand-back lessons which are sort of bigger ones about force structure, force generation, dependence on contractors, reserves, those sorts of things. Some experimentation under the Agile Warrior program, which was started 3 or 4 years ago and had matured sufficiently to inform some of this work, particularly about the nature of operations in complex environments such as urban areas, which is where we expect to be drawn to primarily in the future. And then we tested these things in a more conceptual sense against what are known as the SAG scenarios, the Strategic Assumptions Group scenarios, which is a sort of menu of situations that represent what various joint force...
These are operational scenarios.
Yeah, operational scenarios, joint force packages. They're not an army phenomenon, it's a VCDS-run joint phenomenon, which takes account of wider government agencies as well. So we sort of pressed the test in empirically and conceptually in as many ways as we can. A lot of the equipment that we're bringing into this force structure is stuff that we've got day-to-day experience of using in quite a hostile environment and a threatening environment in Afghanistan, as you know. Although we will be obviously making much broader use of those systems in a less specific situation, and we'll be getting back into a much more sort of manoeuvrist use of our broader core equipment fleet, tanks, Warrior, etc. But inevitably there's a bit of trial and error about this, and until we've actually lived the structure, until we've lived the force generation and training system, we're not going to know whether we've optimized this or not. It all goes back to the business of how do we get the optimum capability out of the resources we have. But of course the optimum capability needs to take account of the fact that the question may keep changing. And we may absolutely get optimized balance for a supposition about the type of campaign and the nature of conflict, and suddenly find actually the question's moved on, which inevitably happens. So we're by no means complacent that we've got this right. We do, in terms of independent scrutiny, there's no one providing that service, sadly. But we do compare notes with other nations in Europe, with our close allies in the United States Army and Marine Corps, which gives us two comparators. And all of that's been factored into the mix.
Okay, thank you. I mean, one of the other aspects of that, I'd like to come back to integration, if I could, in a second. But the if you like, the political decision making, the democratic deficit. I mean, I'll come clean. I've just signed Julian Brazier. It's his fault. An amendment to the reform bill, which we're going to put down, which is about annual reporting to Parliament about cadets. It's an amendment that will be discussed within that context. But there are lots of other things where Parliament needs to understand, because what strikes us is you're on a journey and you have to take a lot of people with you, especially if the reserve thing is going to work. So the better the understanding, the more informed the decision making, hopefully. So that's why we're asking the questions about how you're going to inform people, and more importantly, not just Parliament, but the general debate about how you test these things and see their evolution as to whether they're really working or whether they're rhetorically working.
I mean, there's two aspects I'd like to pick up. First, informing people, and then leading everybody through the change programme is something where, to be honest, I think we've got off to a pretty good start. We were able to explain this very fulsomely in terms of the challenge that had been set. Going back to the conversation I had, with the previous Secretary of State, at the point where we were told these are the parameters. I think we've been able to, we weren't able to consult inside the Army as much as we would have liked because of the sensitivity over regimental structures, and we didn't want it all to get out piecemeal and end up with all sorts of lobby groups. So we did it the way we did it. But I think we've compensated for that in terms of the way we've involved people subsequently in the detailed implementation. And I wouldn't want to give you the impression that we have picked a point in space to which we're trying to march, and we can't modify that. Actually, what we've got is a sort of a generic direction of travel, which takes account of rebasing the army from Germany, changing our training model, an equipment program that inevitably we can veer and haul, new contractual practices to make sustainment more affordable. And then the way we're going to integrate the regular and reserve. All of those are parts of the big idea which would endure in a slightly different interpretation of future conflict or a slightly different resource envelope and so on. And so I see those being constants within with a bit of wiggle room.
I want to talk about integration. Sorry.
And I think and because of that, as we keep turning these stones over and say, okay, well, we're coming to the next bit of detailed work on implementation, we can change it, and we can take account of ideas from the younger cohort, and we can feed in at any stage lessons from operations, including what the French did in Mali or whatever it might be.
Madeleine Moon. We're going to come back to some of these questions about integration, but Madeleine Moon is coming now.
I have to say I'm a little confused because I feel as if I'm getting mixed messages about we're going into a new period of peace where we can safely draw down, we can look at reservists, and yet we're told that we're going to be taking bigger parts in Somalia, Africa, the Gulf, the Far East. We'll be offering training missions, we'll be having preemptive intervention, preventing conflict before they start. So which is it that we're going to be doing, and have we discussed how our apparent aspirations, spelled out in yesterday's Times, sits alongside our new structure? Have we discussed this with our NATO allies, given that we're quite clear that we will always be taking forward operations in coalition in the future? How much discussion took place with NATO before the new structure was set in place?
Maybe the word peace is causing the confusion. Let me treat peace as a word, as a proxy for not conducting an enduring operation at scale, which is what we've been doing for the last decade. And our planning assumption is that we will not expect to be continuously conducting enduring operations at scale. All of the things you talked about, upstream engagement activities in particular, small-scale interventions, will absolutely form part of our future planning scenario, and the armed forces retain the capability to operate at scale and on an enduring basis, but increasingly with the support of reservists and contractors. That's part of the construct that the CGS has described. So I don't find that confusing, to be perfectly honest. I think it's very clear that as we come out of these enduring operations, the SDS, the Strategic Defence and Security Review, has identified some different roles that the military will be taking on, particularly in conflict prevention and capacity building around the world in seeking to prevent conflict. And in answer to your NATO question, I can answer that at the NATO political level. We discuss routinely in NATO ministerial meetings and in the NATO international staff how NATO can support conflict prevention and capacity building, how we can operate forward of the NATO homeland area in order to deliver the territorial security that was the basis of NATO's original creation, recognizing that many of the threats to the NATO nations now originate in the area immediately to our south and southeast, and often the most effective way to address them will be early intervention in those areas.
Secretary of State, you're much more positive about sticking your finger in a hornet's nest that all of these areas of operation involve than I certainly would be. And the question was, in terms of our reconfiguration, the planned reconfiguration of our armed forces and the reduction to 82,000, what has been the response from our NATO allies?
Obviously, I think it's fair to say there is nobody in NATO who welcomes any reduction in force levels by any of the NATO partners. But equally, this is happening across NATO, with the exception of Norway, which has the good fortune to be sitting on a seemingly bottomless pit of gas, and Poland, which has its defence budget fixed in the constitution as a percentage of GDP. Every other NATO country has been feeling the consequences of fiscal constraint, from the US with its very large sequestration program, the French, our closest allies and partners in Europe, who have had to address a very significant fiscal challenge in their white paper published earlier this year. This is something that all of us are having to deal with, and across NATO, the clear agenda is to make this work by collaborating more together, joint forces initiative, making sure that we retain the benefits of working together that we've developed during the Afghan campaign operating as ISAF at 50, that we don't allow those benefits of interoperability to be lost in the post-Afghanistan period, and more focus on joint equipment procurement and joint equipment operation and support as a way of delivering more with the limited budgets that we have available.
Do I have it?
Right. Can I go back to this question of integration? Because we seem to now have a given in terms of structure on the current sort of basic budget. We've got that on our planning assumptions. One of the things about it, however, is the integration of regulars with reservists. And a lot of the discussion has been about that integration. But you've said, Sabina, that it's both them and contractors. And I think this is an area that has not been fully understood or very, very well sort of talked about in terms of there are three elements, effectively, not two, within the army. And then if you extrapolate that for whole force structures and the whole force, then it becomes another argument. And then you've got DFID and you've got conflict. So this question of integrating, who are you integrating, how are you integrating, what's the planning for integration? It's more than just training of regulars together with reservists if you're going to introduce contractors and all these other elements.
Well,
so can you speak to that?
Yeah, I can. I mean, let's just deal with the uniform piece first, if we could. In the higher readiness part of our force, the reaction force, there is a dependency on individual reservists to the tune of about 10%, which is about what we're doing on a day-to-day basis in Afghanistan now. And that's from the combat arms going through the force. In the adaptable force, which is the organisation that will really be doing more of this defence engagement stuff on a day-to-day basis, but is capable of being tuned to produce a combined arms brigade, what was known as a multi-role brigade in old parlance. That has around 30 to 35% reservists in it, most of whom are in what we call subunits, companies, squadrons or batteries. And the adaptable force regular units have had their size reduced on the assumption that that proportion of their force, basically the fourth subunit, will come from their paired reserve sort of cousins. And so, if you and I were, commanding officers of the sort of, 2nd and 3rd battalions of the Lancashire Regiment, for the sake of argument, and you were the regular and I was the reservist, which would be a fine arrangement. Then we would know that for a particular year in the readiness cycle, it was our job to make sure that collectively we could produce that force. And but we're in that partnership throughout the whole cycle and over time. And so when you're going off to do a defence engagement task with a small short-term training team in your specific part of the defence engagement landscape, and each brigade has a specific zone of the globe where it has primacy for liaison and engaging these tasks, then you'd probably expect to take some reservists so that we're all kind of clutched together. So I think that this is a particularly pertinent relationship. It means that the training and operational staff in the regular force can be adding weight to the training of reservists, which is all about getting competence to the right level to withstand all the rigours of, coroner's inquests, heaven forbid, in the context of discretionary operations. So we're setting the bar quite high here, but the integration, should give us the right DNA to get there.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of contractors,
that's what I was going to ask you. Yeah.
This is about volume provision of service, but obviously it's got to plug into the back of our force somewhere. I say the back, you know what I mean, into the logistic echelon of our force. At the margin, there will be some contractors who, at a peacetime tick-over scale, provide those functions for us in our day-to-day peacetime business, who could transition to have people in uniform when we go into the battle space, so-called sponsored reserves, We already have some of those in things like our tank transporter contracts, for example. Not all that many. But there's tremendous scope here to increase that population so that you've got much more surety of understanding as a contractor goes from a sort of tick over peacetime mode to something that's in a forward area. Now, we're not assuming that the contractor's going to take up those roles in the heat of battle in the first couple of iterations of an intervention operation. But once things stabilise into a sort of framework context where the geography isn't shifting, we can create the right sort of force-protected areas, a la Camp Bastion, for example, then all the evidence from Afghanistan tells us that particularly if we're doing it in a premeditated way rather than picking up contractors in theatre in the sort of heat of the campaign, as we did in 2008 and 9, that we should be able to do this in a pretty structured and cost-effective way with a very high assurance of delivery.
Okay. Julian Burton. Thank you. Before asking my question, could I just ingratiate myself by saying that in strongly supporting the vision you've just outlined, Sir Peter, there was still one Sergeant Major left from the London Rifle Brigade defence of Calais, and that is exactly how that battalion was used by its two regular battalions in that heroic defence relatively early on in the war. It's not a new concept, it's a bloody good concept, which is we're resuscitating. My question though is this. I want to come back to this point on integration. The area where we're deficient compared to our English-speaking counterparts is in the commanding officer slots in units, a very small proportion now, and I think it's down, I believe, to less than a third, held by reservists. The particular concern, and I know you've taken a close personal interest in this, the particular concern that keeps getting fed back to me is not that the process is hugely unfair for selection or anything like that, but that in exaggerating the amount of time needed by a commanding officer, the template has been written in a way that rules out people very often with good quality civilian jobs. Abroad, the lesson again and again is you get good COs by having people with good civilian jobs who give a modest amount of time with good full-time support. Could I put that thought to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been around this point, and I know you take a close personal interest in our boarding process. And the statistics are not a secret, but obviously the detailed discussions are confidential. But I keep a pretty close eye on those who are eligible, those who are actually making themselves available in a given time frame, which is normally probably 30% fewer, and then how they match against their regular counterparts. And I think at the moment we've got the balance about right, bearing in mind all the complex things we're trying to do, which are more than a part-time command function when we're trying to change this model so dramatically, and we've got such a significant recruiting challenge. And I wouldn't want to do anything that was going to sort of reduce the impetus on that and emphasis on that for all the reasons that the committee understands. I think when we've got more people who've been through this cycle in company command tours, for example, earning their spurs alongside their regular counterparts in these paired organisations, then I hope that will stimulate a slight rebalancing in the direction you'd like to see.
Bob Stewart. Actually, could I ask one other question? Just a very quick one before we bring Bob in. Very quick. With your other hat on, CGS, are you happy with the way in which Army medicals, regular and reserve, are becoming more and more politically correct? So many of my friends' sons have failed their Army medicals because of rugby injuries. It's becoming harder and harder, it seems to me.
I mean, I'm not sure that it's anything to do with political correctness, but it may. I've certainly heard some stories myself where old injuries are being treated, I think, too sensitively. And the Director General of the Army Medical Services is currently doing a study, which reports in the next couple of months. Wanted to do a thorough job to work out how we take this forward.
We discussed this only the other day, but it's worth saying that part of the reconstruction of the reserves is a raising of the medical standards, the fitness standards required. Because we're talking about people who have to be capable of deploying alongside their regular counterparts and having comparable levels of fitness. And One of the things that we've been very open about, and the CDS in his article in the Times, I think, this week made direct reference to this. It may be the case that we lose some people from the Army Reserve in the short term as a consequence of requiring higher standards of fitness. Not all of the people who are in now may be capable of meeting those standards. But if we're going to get the reserve right and make it an effective and functioning part of this integrated army, we have to bite that bullet.
Get more votes from
I think that's a very important point. If you were expecting to just achieve straight line growth to where we need to be without some slight turbulence in the existing trained strength of the reserve by dint of A, medical standards, B, the slightly different habits that this force is going to have to adopt, C, the geographical adjustments we're making to get to the new order of battle, the new force structure. I think that we'd be optimistic if we weren't going to see a little bit of natural wastage inspired by that, which is above the average.
Okay.
And we
No,
should
we should see that as an essential element of this transition. We need short questions and short answers, please, in order to get through what we need to.
Chairman, I take direction. Could I ask Secretary of State and CGS, one of you can answer, which is the top strength of Army 2020 and what's its weakness? Just one. Top strength of it and what's the thing that worries you most about it?
I think the top strength is operational capability for the resources allocated.
Okay, and the weakness?
And I think the weakness is that there will be some areas where resilience turns out to be less than we will need and we'll have to take remedial action.
Thank you. Is that short enough, Chairman?
That's very good. Good question, good answer. You clearly nodded, Secretary of State, so you agree with him.
Absolutely defer to the CGS on this. Yeah.
Gisa Stewart.
Secretary of State, despite the fact that you don't quite like our definition of being left alone in peace, I want to take you back to that phrase. Because you did say, left alone in peace with the budget that we have assumed, we will manage to deliver the output. Now, being left in peace also means you have no access to urgent operational requirements, doesn't it?
Sorry, I'd have to go back to the context. I think it sounds to me as though I was saying left alone in peace, i.e. left alone to get on with this, with the budgets that we have.
The key question of me is that if we are now into planned operation, that also means you will no longer have access to URs.
Yes, that's correct.
We're talking about the core budget.
That is correct.
Do your plans mean that you can actually, have you got enough budget without URs to deliver what you want to do?
Yes, URs provide support for equipment which is delivered for a specific operation. They do not provide us funding to hold that equipment in core. So where we are bringing equipment that was delivered as a UOR into Afghanistan back into core at the end of the campaign, we have to provide from within our core budget a funding line to support that equipment once it's returned to core. And our planning assumptions absolutely do not include provision of UOR equipment for our standing capability in the future.
So, as far as your answer to this committee is, you can operate without the URs on your budget with Army 2020 plans. You've got the budget.
Yes.
Okay. The next thing I want to take you to is take you back to this rather interesting article in the Times. Military Chief outlines Britain's global strategy. And CBS describes Malcolm Rifkind and Liam Fox as salivating defeatists because they cast doubt on the Army 2020 plans. Would you share that view, or would you choose a different set of words?
Well, first of all, I don't think the CDS did say that. I think that's a journalistic interpretation. And secondly, I was very pleased to see the CDS.
Salivating defeatist, that's a rather ingenious phrase
yes,
in quotation marks to have come up, wouldn't you have thought?
The CDS used that term, absolutely. But
so you did use those words?
The names it has been coupled with, I do not believe, were the CDS's words.
So who are the salivating defeatists then?
Well, Sir Bob Russell makes an interesting suggestion upon which I couldn't possibly comment. But look, there are a lot of people out there who are telling us a few weeks into this 5-year campaign that we will fail. I take comfort from the fact that people in the army tell me that they are quite used to people telling them at the early stages of campaigns that it's not possible, and they routinely demonstrate that it is. I am very confident, and you've heard the CGS's confidence, that we will be able to deliver this agenda. It will be challenging, but nobody ever suggested that the things we're trying to do are not challenging. We know what we have to do. We will deliver it.
But can I just, who do you think he might have had in mind? I mean, it's such a strong term, salivating defeatist.
He's a
he must have
Yorkshireman.
had someone in mind.
He's a Yorkshireman. You tend to get strong terms. Look, there are a large number of people out there who are routinely commenting that we're not going to deliver the numbers, we're not going to be able to deliver the reserve force, and there are people who have sought to deploy to stimulate doubt about our delivery of the reserve force in order to advance an argument about particular units in the regular army that are to be disbanded.
So what phrase would you use for Liam Fox and Sir Malcolm Rifkind if they're not salivating defeatists?
I haven't talked to either of them in the context.
But they have doubts.
I haven't talked to either of them in the context of the creation of the reserve force, although my predecessor did note in a newspaper article that it had been his intention to build the reserve before drawing down the regular force. My comment to that would be the one I've already made here today, and I made in the House yesterday, that would be an unfunded strategy.
Because we've got limited time, I won't press this further, but can I just leave you with a thought? Mrs. Madeleine Moon raised that question in relation to NATO, but also I find it very difficult to reconcile in my own mind an Army 2020 that is wants to be left in peace, that wants to be planned, and at the same time we are now planning action in places like Africa, which before we hadn't done so. And you tried to explain that contradiction, but it still doesn't make sense.
I think the discussion is missing the key factor here, which is scale.
Which is what?
Scale. The numbers involved in these defence scale, that is to say size, the size of the force. An 82,000 standing army is a large organisation, and it needs to be engaged in interesting, challenging and relevant tasks continuously to sustain the enthusiasm that allows us to retain the talent we need for all the sort of uncertainties we're going to face in the future. And so these defence engagement tasks and sort of partner support tasks, such as what's going on in the context of support to AMISOM in Somalia, training under the EU training mission, the Malian army, and putatively, when it gets going, what we're doing with the Libyan militias in terms of training there, are all well within the scope of the army and its future size, let alone where it is slightly larger on the rundown to that. Even when we still have 7,000 or 8,000 people in Afghanistan, admittedly coming down quite fast at the end of this year, and the next brigade training. I mean, we need these. We don't need these tasks, but we're much better off with them. We don't need them to exist, but to sustain our optimal efficiency and competence. They're extremely stimulating things for people to do, and obviously they need to be seen in the context of national strategy to be justified.
Talking about that, the CGS, what changes are going to be needed to the training regime as a result of this?
Well, we've just completed a detailed study as to essentially for both the reaction force and the adaptable force as to what their training cycle ought to be, and of course in the case of the adaptable force that has to take account of the implications for reservists and so on. What the tempo of that training should be. Historically the Army was on a 30-month training cycle. We're going on to a 36-month training cycle. which is to take some of the steam out of it, and it also actually is more cost effective. We're doing that. The top-end training, combined arms manoeuvre training, will still be done in Canada, subject to us being able to negotiate a suitable package with the Canadian government and the Canadian military. And the Secretary of State's just sort of kicked that ball off in discussions at ministerial level, and we'll be working with them to map out a new arrangement that will come into being at the beginning of the 2015 training season. In parallel with that, we've significantly expanded the number of small exercises that we do for both regular and reserve in a number of training areas around the world, which give us a mixture of environments, obviously from cold through desert to jungle and so on. Going back really to where we were a few years ago, when the pressure of training for Iraq and Afghanistan prevented us having the time to go and do those sorts of training engagements. And I think in the case of quite a lot of those dispersed sort of small exercises at, for example, company or squadron level, they also offer very significant partnering arrangements in the defence engagement context. So the defence engagement piece is actually getting fused into our training regime where appropriate. It's a new look approach. It's being driven by the way in which we get the best out of smaller training fleets, out of contractorised training support, with a heavy emphasis on investment in state-of-the-art simulation, which has been such an important part of preparing people for Afghanistan.
Will there be differences between the reserves training for the adaptive forces as opposed to the reaction force?
Yes, there will. And if I'm really honest, we haven't quite worked out how in a given unit, individuals going off with the reaction force versus the people who are going to be part of the sort of company that's required to be produced for Mr. Havar's battalion when he goes out of the door, is in my analogy I was using earlier. How that will juggle. But we've got enough manned training days, as they're called, training days for each individual in the sort of sump to make that a pretty rich proposition.
Okay, thank you.
Chairman, can I just in case somebody reads the record and has a heart attack, we're not actually planning to train Libyan militia. We're planning to train members of the Libyan armed forces, which may, of course, include reintegrated members
those
of the militia.
Those
are the ones the CGS.
They're the ones that need the training.
Okay. Bob Stewart.
The withdrawal from Germany, I'll be quick because I know time is against us. I take it that's going on schedule. Fine, let's leave that. The second question then is, are we likely to retain any training rights? We've got Suffield, but are we likely to retain any training rights in Germany? Because we've got fairly substantial, decent setup there as well.
We're looking at it. They're not so much rights as privileges.
Sorry, wrong word.
And we've got to make sure that we do that in concert with the Bundeswehr, with whom we're having a very active dialogue. We do, of course, have access to NATO ranges in Bergen, which you'll be well familiar with. So should we wish to, I think the opportunity will be there. It comes down to need, cost, fleet sizes, and all those sorts of things. In terms of our ability to cooperate with the German army, particularly in the armoured space, it's very attractive. But we have to see whether it's going to be part of the plot.
A throwaway remark, and it's my last one, but I was speaking to a Russian officer that suggested we might like to train in Russia. It might be cheap. But I mean, I don't know whether that's out of the question.
The Kazakh defence minister, when he was here last week, invited us to use training areas in Kazakhstan. There are plenty of offers around. It's about finding what is most cost effective and delivers the most appropriate training.
Final question, Derek Twigg.
Yes, you mentioned in one of your answers a few minutes ago that obviously this is putting pressure on certain areas in terms of resilience, but you would have to find contingency for that. Could you maybe expand on actually where those pressure points will be on resilience, and are you absolutely confident that they can be dealt with?
Yeah, I think that in our force structure, we're conscious that we've made certain assumptions about the balance between regular, reserve and contractor logistics. And if those assumptions turn out to be incorrect, then we may find that the dependence on regulars because of the threat situation or the tempo of operations or some other unforeseen sort of delta is greater than we would like. And in that situation, we might have to, re-roll people from other parts of the army to do, transport functions and things like that. I think that we can see increasing pressure on the demand for bandwidth, communications bandwidth in the tactical space. We've taken account of that in our design by actually pro rata, reducing the royal signals by considerably less than the 20% average. But even so, I can see that demand growing as a consequence of the changing nature of the way that business is done in the future, which is not so much a function of size, but the changing character of the way we do things with an increasing dependence on high resolution imagery for targeting and things like that. I can see that happening. And I think in the gunners and the sappers, we also might find that they're running a little bit faster than we would like, and some of their other cat badge counterparts. But that's often been the case in the previous structures of the army, depending on the nature of a specific operation and where the emphasis lies.
And do you think we'll be able to attain the quality and number of special forces with this much reduced army?
I think, I think that's a really key point, because there is a sort of there's inevitably a gene pool issue here, and we've done some work on it, and we think that the types of people who are going to join the smaller army are going to be more at that end of the spectrum than just a sort of squad average person, if you like. So I think those, with the right sort of incentives, the right sort of stimulus, particularly as we come off operations in Afghanistan and special forces operations look a little bit more unique than they have for the last 10 years, we're pretty confident we'll get there.
That's a really interesting answer, and the best answer to that question, which we've been putting now for a number of years, that I've heard, so thank you. That's the end of this evidence session. You may regard us, CGS, as hopeless pessimists, but actually our role is to question everything that you do. And we will now consider what you said. We may ask further questions in writing or something like that if something comes up that we need further elucidation on. But Secretary of State, CGS, thank you very much indeed for a very interesting evidence.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now I'll ask the room to clear, because we've still got a bit of private business to conclude with, but this evidence session is over.